Hello, Emu. How are you?
Hi, Rabbi Foreman. I am great. Thank God.
Excellent.
Um, I want to do something exciting and new with you today, which is to catch you unawares and show you some really interesting stuff in Torah that you've never seen before and get your honest reactions to it.
All right, that sounds good, Emu. I'm looking forward to that. Lay it on me.
Welcome, everybody, to a brand new season of A Book Like No Other. As you just heard, this time things are going to be a little bit different. We're flipping the script, and this season, I'm going to be the one who is presenting to Rabbi Foreman and leading him as best as I can through the text. It's something that we've never really done before on the show, and honestly, I am very nervous about it. Let me tell you the story of how this season came to be. So, a few months ago, Rabbi Foreman was deep in deadline mode writing his upcoming book on Devarim. And around that time, our friend, Michelle Zeriker, reached out. Now, Michelle is someone that we've learned a lot from over the years. She is a real Talmidah Chachama. She knows the text backwards and forwards. She actually won a Chidon Tanakh. And she said she'd found something really interesting and she was like rushing to show it to Rabbi Foreman. But since he was racing up against his book deadline, I volunteered to step in between Michelle and Rabbi Foreman and let Rabbi Foreman keep writing. And honestly, I went into that conversation a little bit skeptical. Michelle had told me that she had noticed things in Exodus 16 in the chapter dealing with the mun. And I mean, come on. How many times have we at Aleph Beta studied the chapter on the mun? What could possibly be hiding there that we hadn't already uncovered? Well, boy, did I have egg on my face because Michelle showed me many strong and surprising intertextual parallels that we legitimately had never seen before. And I knew that I just had to bring them to Rabbi Foreman. But I realized something. This could actually be a great opportunity to take you guys even more behind the scenes of what we do at Aleph Beta. Because you see, usually here on A Book Like No Other, you're listening to the end result of Rabbi Foreman's process. After he spent 40, 60, sometimes 80 hours or more working through a text, assembling documents, and testing theories. What you don't usually get to experience is him working through the puzzle pieces in real time. That is exactly what we're going to share with you this season. I'm going to be presenting Michelle's findings to Rabbi Foreman, along with some of my own, and you're going to hear Rabbi Foreman's genuine, unfiltered reactions as he encounters this material for the very first time. I am super excited to take you along on this journey with us, but know that it's going to be slightly different of a ride than usual. Oh, and our topic? Well, as I said, we're going to start in Exodus chapter 16. It's the chapter in which God first gives the people the mun, this miraculous bread that falls from the heavens to sustain Israel in the desert. So, without any further ado, let's jump in and take a look at what Michelle noticed in the mun story in chapter 16. And we're going to start with our corner pieces, as we like to call them here in Aleph Beta. I'm Emu Shalev, and this is Aleph Beta's A Book Like No Other, generously sponsored by Shari and Nathan Lindenbaum.
So, the first thing that we do when we show parallels is we look at not any dinky old middle piece, but we look at a corner piece. So I
Hmm.
need to show you the corner pieces.
Would
All
you
right.
care to explain what a corner piece is, Emu, for those uninitiated?
Yes, the easiest pieces to start with when you're building a puzzle is you find those four corner pieces because with those grounding you, you can find the piece that attaches to it next, the piece that attaches to it next. You create a perfect frame, and once you have your frame, then the middle pieces can fit in, and your puzzle starts coming together. It's a far faster, more efficient way to assemble a puzzle.
And just to be a little bit clear about it, the one of the beautiful things I find about corner pieces, about this analogy, is that a corner piece is a piece that you know exactly where it goes in the puzzle without needing to have any other piece as a reference point.
Mm. Hmm.
So, um, similarly, corner pieces in intertextual methodology is like if the Torah wants to relate one text to another, how in the world is anyone supposed to know that? The answer is corner pieces will tell you. You
Hmm.
gotta be sensitive enough that when there's a corner piece screaming at you, look in Jeremiah 48, right? Or this is the only other time this appears. A corner piece is a piece that you know where it goes without reference to any other text. It screams of itself, go look at this other passage. And
Hmm.
then what happens is once you have a few of those corner pieces, then you begin to see the rest of the puzzle. There are some pieces which you would not have noticed belong, and once you see the corner pieces, you realize, oh yeah, that actually paired with this idea, and look, that idea is right over here too. So little intermission there.
Yeah, no, but a very worthwhile intermission. Okay, without further ado, let me show you the corner piece. So come with me to Exodus 16, verse 16. And the context here is that the manna begins to rain down, and the people see this bread that falls from the heavens. And then, verse 16,
Yeah,
Moshe answers them what this thing is.
right. So what happens is, well, verse 15 is when they don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm.
And it's when Moshe answers them, and Moshe says, Hu halechem asher natan Hashem la'achla. This is the bread that God has given you to eat. And you want me to go to the next verse, is that right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Zeh hadavar asher tziva Hashem. This is what God has commanded. Liktu mimenu ish lefi achlo, omer la gugolet. Every man should gather from it according to what they can eat, an omer's worth for each head, mispar nafshatechem, for the number of souls that are being fed, presumably. Ish la asher ba'olo tikachu, the number of souls, each a man, for those in his tent.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
Great. So now there is a corner piece in this verse, and it's a little bit wily, but there is a phrase here that is very rare. And that
Is it
phrase is
mispar nafshatechem?
no, it is not that one. I'm gonna guess again,
Okay.
as we're striking out words in this verse.
Let's see. Is it leak to mimenu? No.
It is not Liktumi Manu. It's the very next words.
Ish lefi achlo.
Ish
Ish lefi
lefi
achlo.
each person according to what they can eat. Does that
Is
remind you of
that,
anything?
yeah, it does. Is that not the Korban Pesach?
It is the Korban Pesach. Give this man a free Coke. If you go to
Yeah.
Exodus 12, verse
Hold
4,
on. Let's go to Exodus 12, verse 4.
you can read verse 3 and then verse 4.
Dabru al kol adat ben Yisrael lemor. Odat Yisrael lemor. Be'asol hachodesh hazav yichlem ish sela beit abat sela bayit. Everyone should take themselves a sheep for the house of their fathers, a sheep for their house. Imi bat habayit miyot miseh. If they can't eat a whole set. They can go and with their neighbors take b'michsat nefashot, covering their souls. Ish lefi ochlo, each man according to what they can eat. Tachosu can cover themselves al haseh. Yeah, there it is. Ish lefi ochlo.
Right? Each person
Yep.
according to what they can eat. In one case, each person according to what they can eat is going to be man. Each person according to what you can eat in 12:4 is going to be
Korban
Korban
Pesach is going to be
Pesach.
the Pesach offering when they were back in Egypt.
There's something else that I should show you that I think is we're still in corner piece territory. Why don't you read verse 10?
Sure. Verse 10 in the Korban Pesach narrative, Lo
Yeah.
totir minu ad boker. Oh, that reminds us of something with the manna, doesn't it? You shall not
Mm-hmm.
leave any over until the morning. And if you do, anotir minu ad boker ba'esh tisrofu, that which is left over in the morning, you have to get rid of with fire. And lo and behold, we had a very similar command with the manna. With the manna, we said you're supposed to gather it all. And verse 19 says, Ish al yoter menu ad boker. You shouldn't leave any over until the morning. But they didn't do it. Vayotirim anashim menu ad boker. And lo and behold, they found when they tried to save some for the morning, vayarum tolaim vayivash. It actually stank because worms infested it. So what happens is
But
that
there's
in
a
each
little
case,
word hiding in that word vayivash. What word do you see?
yeah, that word it would be eish, but eish tisrofu. Interesting. So it's a play on words. When you leave it over into the morning, but eish tisrofu, you have to get rid of it in the fire. It's almost like God's way of getting rid of it with fire was with these worms that caused it to stink, because vayivash, which means to stink, is a play off of the beit ayin shin of vayivash. So that's kind of interesting.
One more corner piece. Take a look at Exodus 16, verse 29.
Ru'u ki Hashem natan lachem ha-Shabbat. Moses says, look, God has given you the Sabbath. Al kain hu noten lachem b'yom hashishi. That's why he gives you on 6 days lechem yamayim, a double portion, shvu ish tachtav. Al yetzei ish mimkoma b'yom hashvi. Everybody sit where they are. Nobody go out collecting on the seventh day.
Okay. Now, does that remind you of anything in the Korban Pesach? The
Okay.
second half of the verse in Exodus 16.
Shvu ish tachtav, al yetzei ish mimkomo. Oh,
Slowly.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm.
al yetzei ish mimkomo b'yom hashvi'i. Are you talking about the idea that a person can't go outside their house? Isn't that
Yeah.
all night long? Everyone's supposed to be in the house, and they only go
Exactly.
out in the morning. Where is that
Exactly.
verse?
It's going to be in Exodus 12, verse 22.
Ulakachtam agudat ezov v'tzvalta b'dam asher basap yigatam l'mashkem v'lo bezuzos. Right? Vatem lo tetzu ish mipetach beito ad boker. So no one's allowed to go out until the morning. Here, no one's allowed to go out until the evening, which would be until the Sabbath is over. But again, there's this notion that nobody leaves the house, or they didn't really have houses. Nobody's leaving their spot, right? So yeah,
That's
that
right.
is pretty interesting.
That's right. And they're pretty different, right? In Exodus 12, don't go outside because there's a plague. The whole Pesach ritual is like warding off your home so that God passes over you. Definitely you don't want to go outside because you could die. Whereas in Exodus 16, right? Why can't you go outside again?
Because the opposite of plague, there is this wonderful tranquility, and the tranquility is just going to be enjoyed in your house. You don't need to go outside. You don't have to, for your sustenance, right, go
Right. So
outside.
same law. Nobody can go outside. Entirely different reason. One is because there's a plague outside and you might die. And this time, don't go outside. Why do you need to go outside? Chill out at home. There's no reason to go outside. No labor that needs to be done. Kick your feet up. Take a rest. Right. Completely different energies, but same words. So these three phrases and concepts, I think, really convince me that something is going on.
So those were our three corner pieces. And while they already convinced me that there had to be a connection between the text of the Man and the text in Korban Pesach, the question was, did they convince Rabbi Foreman? And he later told me that they did, mostly. You see, Rabbi Foreman is never one to take evidence at face value. He firmly believes that when researching something in the Torah, you really have to sit with it. You got to reflect on it and literally map it out in a chart. When he did, he noticed something that I had totally missed. He saw that all three of these corner pieces not only linked these two texts, but they were in order. The phrase, ish lefi ochlo, each one according to what they can eat, that's the first phrase to appear in both texts. Al or lo totiru mimenu ad boker, the prohibition to leave any food over, that appears next in both texts. And finally, al yetzei ish or lo tetzu ish, the requirement to stay inside, that's the last corner piece in both texts. Three solid corner pieces, and they were in order. Rabbi Foreman told me that was what really got his complete buy-in on the evidence. But what did it mean that these texts were connected? Why did the Korban Pesach seem to be replaying itself in the Mun? And why were some of these connections inverses of one another? I hope that as we moved on from those corner pieces to the other noticings that I had to share with Rabbi Foreman, more of the puzzle would start to come together. Honestly, I shared a whole bunch of smaller connections with Rabbi Foreman, way more than can fit into this episode. And if you want to see them, you can find a link in the description to a PDF that really maps them all out, color-coded and all. But I want to take you to one of the later connections that I shared with Rabbi Foreman, one that actually presented another interesting inverse between the Mun and Korban Pesach, and it would end up laying the groundwork for an answer to some of our questions.
The next thing that I just want to take you to, there's this one verse that stuck out at me in Exodus 12 that I kept thinking about that just felt like should be a part of it, right? Like we say it in the Haggadah that in the Korban Pesach, right? That it wasn't just meat and bread, but there was something else. There was another element. Do you know what verse I'm talking about?
Are you talking about Merorim?
Yeah. Matzot u'merorim yochlu. You're supposed to eat this meat and bread with bitters or bitter herbs.
Mm-hmm. Where was that? What verse?
It's verse 8.
So you have to eat it with bitterness.
So I'm like, there's meat, there's bread, there's bitters. if these things should be connected, then there should be meat and bread and bitters in Exodus 16 in the story of the man, but there is no bitter in the story of the man. I looked and I looked and I looked and I couldn't find it. So I was thinking, look, I don't have bread, meat, and bitters. Do I have an inverse in the man? Maybe something that wasn't bitter, but the opposite of that.
Because it was sweet. It was specifically like dvash. That's
Exactly.
interesting.
And this is Exodus 16, verse 31. Right? Vayikru Beit Yisrael et shmo man. The people called it man. Vehu kizera gad lavan. V'tamo ketzapichit bidvash. Tasted like, I don't know, fried in honey. And that, at this point, I'll be honest with
Like a
you, I don't know.
sufgania,
Yeah, it tasted like Krispy Kreme. Right?
right?
At this point, I leaned back in my chair and I kind of laughed because I thought this was very funny. Uh, that you'd have meat and bread and you'd have the bitters, but this time it wouldn't be bitters. That
Right, specifically because the Torah is saying all matzot marim yochlu, right? Because the marim is what's giving the distinctive taste. That's saying, oh wow, the whole thing is going to taste bitter because of this bitterness. Whereas over here, the whole experience of maybe eating the meat together with the bread is a very sweet experience. The idea is that um, sweet and bitter are two tastes that take over your palate and is sort of lend their taste to whatever happens, whatever else bland you might be eating.
yeah. And that really tipped things for me because it did feel like the parallels were coming back, but that this one and some of the others are inverses, that they're taking a night that may have been bitter and turning it sweet. They're the same symbols show up, but now they take on something completely different. And this one I think is the most obvious. Um, but I don't know, it made me smile.
So what feels like to me is that there's this evolution, which is that there's a certain kind of symbolic eating on the night of the 14th going into the 15th of the first month that has the memories of bitterness that Israel had from their experience in Egypt, even as they are being reborn into a new nation. And then somehow in 16, you have food that the people desperately need. And somehow there's some sort of inverse. And in this flipped script, there's sweetness, specifically that the sweetness is like dvash. What does that remind you of? Why would manna, of all things, taste like dvash?
Well, Moshe has been promising to take them to the land flowing with milk and honey, right? Eretz zefat
Exactly.
chalav udvash.
Right. So now, if I would say, why does the Carbon Pesach come with merorim?
Oh, that's interesting. So if Dvash is the destination, then Maror is our origin,
Yeah,
our Marorigin.
right. There was something about this eating in Exodus 12, which was reminiscent of the past, but the Vash seems to take you forward into the possibility of a future of a land flowing with milk and honey.
I really appreciated how Rabbi Foreman had taken my noticing of the inverse in taste between bitter maror and sweet mun and run with it. But my mind immediately started turning to other foods that were relevant in Egypt that could play a role in our discussion. And I actually tripped over another key word that we hadn't talked about yet, one that led me to yet another taste. Not just any taste, but a taste that, just like the bitter maror, is a contrast to the sublime sweetness of the mun.
In the story of the Exodus, you have to throw out your chametz and your saor. Oh, that's interesting. I'm so sorry. The word chametz is, um, if you had to vowelize it differently, what else does that word mean?
How else could you valorize chametz?
With
Chametz,
a
vinegar?
Yeah, vinegar, also chamutz, which means sour.
Mm,
Chametz
right.
is sour, which is interesting again, considering that the man is sweet. It's not just the mirorim, the actual bread, right? Bread in Egypt, how did bread in Egypt taste? It tasted sour, sourdough. But God's bread tastes Sweet.
So, but say that's interesting. What you're saying is that you have to throw out your sour bread. Let's just think about that for a moment, right? So there's a process of fermentation that has to do with bread, sourdough bread. And if you eat sourdough bread, what's interesting is that even once you bake it, it still tastes somewhat sour, right? It's a good kind of sour, but it definitely is sour. It has that sort of almost vinegary um,
It's
aftertaste
fermentation.
as
Yeah.
fermentation, right? And so you throw that out, and instead you eat matzah. Now, what I would say is matzah is neutral bread, right? Because it tastes like nothing really, because
Yep.
it doesn't have the sour aspect of it. So it's very bland.
Yep.
And then manna is sweet bread. So it's almost like there's 3 points in a line,
Yep.
which is sour, matzah, neutral, and then manna, sweet. And so
Yep.
the idea is on this day, you throw away your sour bread. But even interestingly, even though you throw away your sour bread, you're still eating tzli eshu matzot al mrorim yachluhu. You're
Yep.
eating matzah, this neutral bread, but you're eating it.
It's almost like remaking sourdough without the corruption of sourdough.
Yeah. In other words, that's interesting. Whereas the connection, eating matzah with mrorim seems like artificially bringing up the taste of sourdough while saying that it's something else. So that's
That's cool. It's
kind
interesting.
of interesting, right? It's this notion that you're gonna have a new kind of bread now, and will make it taste like your old kind of bread that you've always been eating, all the sourdough bread. But you should know that the sour now is separate from the bread, and that you can sort of leave behind the sour part of it, and eventually that will. Oh, you know what's interesting about that? When do you eat matzot or murim?
On that night on Pesach,
And when do you eat matzah?
the 7 days.
Yes. So you understand what's happening? So now the continuum is clear. In other words, until now you were eating sourdough. Suddenly,
Uh-huh, uh-huh. You're
on
saying it
this,
goes from sour to neutral sweet on the
yes.
holiday of
So
Pesach
no,
itself.
it goes from sour to to the break between the sour and the dough to neutral to sweet. Let's make it clear. Let me explain.
Go ahead.
Until now, you were eating sourdough, right? All of a sudden, there's a moment where God says, okay, no more sourdough. Throw out your sourdough. We're going to give you a different kind of bread, but a different kind of bread that we're going to artificially make taste like sourdough because you're going to have matzah, which is neutral bread, but you can eat it al marim. You can eat it with marim, so it has the taste in your mouth as if you're eating sourdough. But
Right.
really, we've redeemed your bread already because the bread is now separate from the sourness,
Right.
right? Then the next
Got
day,
it. So
we're
so
going to
you're play
drop
acting. It's symbol.
we're play acting. We're going to say, okay, now drop the marine part of it and keep your matzah. And you see that there's an evolution in your bread now, right? Because now the bread doesn't even taste maror anymore. Now it just tastes neutral. And for 7 days, you're going to eat neutral bread. And you say, oh, that's very nice. It's neutral. It don't feel like it has much taste to it, but at least it's not sour, right? And then all of a sudden in Exodus 16, God comes along and says, no, there's a new thing, which is the very opposite of sourdough bread. And it's actually sweet bread. It's like Krispy Kreme, and it's really great. And it is foreshadowing sort of a different kind of experience with food, where food um, can be associated with sweetness rather than with bitterness. And maybe that really is what the idea is, which is that maybe food mirrors our experience on some level. And
Mm-hmm.
when the people were in Egypt, they really had bitter experience. And
Mm-hmm.
therefore, your bitter experience makes all food you taste bitter, or
Mm-hmm.
you're just comfortable eating bitter food because it just works with your experience better. So, as a way of God redeeming our experience, God is redeeming our food as a way of redeeming our experience and saying, all right, just sort of, you know, let's make a break between the bitter and the food, and we'll let you have the feel of the bitterness. It'll kind of feel like what you feel kind of familiar, but we've created the break which will allow us to have an evolution. Then let's drop the bitter. Let's just have the bread. And then the bread will eventually become sweet. And that is going to foreshadow a time when your experience is sweet, right? Your experience of the land is sweet. And that will go and reflect itself in your food choices as well.
I was really excited about this possible continuum we had unearthed of sourdough to bitter herbs with matzah to neutral matzah alone to sweet mun. Now, in my mind, this discovery seemed to present the perfect opportunity to suggest a much more speculative connection that I had found between Exodus 12 and 16 and see what Rabbi Foreman thought about it. It had to do with an important element of food in the Exodus story that we hadn't really addressed yet, that I wanted to swing back to, that of seor, or leavening.
I'm jumping to show you something else because this was the more speculative part, but it just fits nicely, or I don't know if it fits nicely. I'm curious to have you react to it. But you just said that the bread somehow is a symbol for our experience. Our experience was bitter, and so you're going to eat, and you, by the way, you also ate sourdough or bitterness. We're gonna then go to put the car in neutral, and then you're gonna put the car in drive, and then the food will be sweet, and hopefully reflect a future sweet experience. But what was gnawing at me is in what, wouldn't it be even more elegant if the food just, wasn't only symbolically connected to their labor or their time, but what if there was a deeper connection between the bread itself and their actual slavery experience, that the metaphor and their real life experience were more intimately connected? Yeah?
Okay.
Okay. So this is not a direct parallel, but I saw something in Exodus 12, which is that you're supposed to tashbitu seor mibatechem. You're supposed to get rid of seor, of leavening from your house. That word seor, leavening, it reminds me of the word sha'ar. It's the same exact letters, but it
Right.
means leftover, right? Which
Hmm.
is how I understand and how I've done this. That's how sourdough is made. You have some flour and you leave it over, and it ferments with the yeast in the air. And that's how seor turns into chametz, right? Seor is the leftover flour, turns into chamutz, it turns into sour. Um, and I thought that would be really cool if I could find that word in Exodus 16. But I couldn't find that word, but I could find the idea of leftover. It's in Exodus 16, verse 23. Moshe is telling the people, this is a Shabbos. Everybody should cook today before Shabbos. And everything that's left over, doesn't use the word sha'ar, but it uses vet kol ha'odef, all the extra, hanichu lachem lemishmeret ad haboker, right? You can actually save it until the next day. This is the exception to leaving over. The only day you're allowed to leave over is from Friday to Shabbos. So I thought that was an interesting parallel. It was not an exact word parallel, but I thought it was really interesting. With me so far?
Yeah, that is interesting. So what you're saying is that you have the idea of leftovers. First of all, you have a theory. Your theory is that Saor is named Saor almost intentionally because of the double entendre with she'er, that somehow what becomes sour is the leftover part. It's interesting that you have tashbitu seor mibatechem, that you are supposed to get rid of the
Leaving
seor, of
over.
the leftovers, and that you have the word Shabbos as a play on words of tashbitu seor, and in the parallel language in Exodus 16, you have kola odef hidnichulam lemishmeret ad haboker on the Sabbath, which is you have leftovers, and instead of getting rid of the leftovers, you have the opposite, which is keep the leftovers for a mishmeret for tomorrow. But what's also really interesting, Emu, is what happens with those leftovers. Those leftovers do not rot, they stay as sweet as before.
That's right.
So the you have the opposite happening with the leftovers, which is that conventional bread leftovers become sourdough, and that's what you have to get rid of with at the moment of Korban Pesach, but and manna will also rot, but it doesn't rot on the Sabbath, and therefore you can keep it. And what you're keeping, the odef in this case, is actually sweet bread instead of sour bread.
Right. So I was meditating on this. I was thinking about this. Like leaving over is um, is generally not great. You're right. All laws seem to be about, anti-leaving over, with one exception when leaving over leads to you resting. Um, is it possible that leaving over in Egypt is not great, right? And it would even be elegant if it would be not great, and the only exception to leaving over would be is if you could rest, right? And in other words, think about what the labor in Egypt was. Egypt is this agrarian powerhouse, right? We talked about them as being the inventors of sourdough. You can only be the inventors of sourdough if you have abundance. You've got a lot of bread. And so much bread that in other cultures you didn't have it lying around, but the Egyptians did. They had it lying around and it turned into beer and it turned into sourdough. Um, but something about these Egyptians made them really fearful about losing their abundance. And what we hear about is how they caused the Israelites to enter into backbreaking labor. And their labor specifically was, do you remember their labor, Rabbi Foreman? What were they building?
Storehouses for bread,
Yeah,
or storehouses for grain.
storehouses for grain. What's the Torah's, what do you remember the language for the storehouses?
Are miskanot.
Are miskinot. Translate that word for me, miskinot.
Well, miskain can be a poor person or an unfortunate person.
Right. It's a double entendre. Miskinot means storehouses, but it possibly comes from the use of miskin, meaning somebody who is poor. Meaning we're terrified of being poor. We're the Egyptians. We don't want to be miskinim. That would be horrible. Let's build storehouses so we can always have grain. And the end of that sentence would be so that each person can get ish lefi ochlo. Everybody could get what they need to eat. But that's not the end of the sentence for the Egyptians. It's so that we can have our sourdough, right? So that we can have sha'ar, we can have saor, we can have leftovers, and we can, enjoy our sourdough. But what they do is they enslave a populace in order to be able to preserve that. So there's no Shabbos, so that we can have sha'ar. And it's interesting that in the man,
So one second,
right?
you're thinking that sha'ar is not just like the little bits of bread that were left over that from which you would make sourdough starter, but you were thinking that it was this conscious desire to
Yes.
hoard and make sure there was bread for tomorrow.
There's one more piece of this in Akev when it talks about the memory of the event of the man, right? The Moshe says that you're going to a land, and this is in Deuteronomy 8, verse 8. Moshe says you're going to a land that is Eretz Chita Useora. You're going to a land of wheat and barley, Geffen, Te'ina, Rimon, Eretz Zeit Shemen, U
Davash.
Vash. You're going to go to a land with tons of these seven species, the last of which is honey. Eretz Asher lo b'miskinut tochal ba'lechem. It is a land lo b'miskinut. That is, what a word that would have been for them. Miskinut was their whole labor. You were building arei miskinot. You're going to the land where there's no miskinut. You're not going to be afraid of being poor, right? Because you'll have tremendous abundance, which is why God gives you this whole mun story, right? The whole reason I gave you the mun is because I want you to remember that when you have your abundance, you shouldn't be afraid that you're going to lose it, and you should also know that it came from God. That to me, actually, I think, and this again, I don't know if this is speculative or if it's striking you as compelling, but if we're looking for a link between the symbols and their actual experience, so if the symbols are their bitterness or their sourness that goes into neutral, that goes into sweet, I can't think of a more direct metaphor than their experience in slavery because their slavery was directly related to bread, related to sourdough, related to having so much abundance that you weren't sharing, that you had no Shabbos, that the bad guys were hoarding so that they can have sourdough. And then there's the evolution to our sweetness, to coming into the land. Actually, you said it, right? They're going to come into the land of honey and lo b'miskinut, where there's no poorness.
It's interesting you point out that in Egypt, hoarding was a culture. It wasn't something which was just born of necessity.
It has to be, right? Vinegar, pickles, cabbage, and bread, chamutz, comes from fermentation. Fermentation comes from having enough that you're leaving over. And this is a theory.
I don't know if you've proven the notion that Egypt used that deleteriously. In other words, that they were hoarding in a way that was problematic rather than prudent, right? Some sort of saving for tomorrow is prudent. But you seem to be arguing that the culture is obsessed with it in a way that makes it not prudent. To me, the evidence, if it comes, would come mostly from Pharaoh, which is the most landed guy of all, who, in the wake of the Joseph story, is, hoarding everything and in essence forcing his own people into a position of slavery because he insists on having all the
Right.
money in the world. Yeah.
Right. I mean, and I think also that the choice to enslave them, particularly to build arei miskinot, right? Like, I think that's
Right.
probably the biggest proof.
Yeah, interesting. So you're saying that this notion of an evolution from sourdough to sweet dough is basically God's way of saying we're moving beyond the hoarding society. And as long as you hoard, all bread will be sour. And if you let go of that and trust in the abundance coming from God, then all bread turns sweet.
Yes. So it's not just like the bread that you were eating or the experience you had was bitter, but your economic system was related to the metaphor here. Like your economic system was bitter and your economic system is going to turn sweet, but the economic system was related to hoarding bread. And it's like if I'm right about this, it would make so much more sense as to why tashbitu se'or mibatechem. Like why is that even a part of the Pesach experience at all? Why do you need to get rid of sourdough on Pesach?
Yeah, that's interesting. But because you say sourdough was born from hoarding bread and keeping it around long enough that it fermented.
That's right.
It's very fascinating because it provides a really interesting lens to a very vexing problem, which is why in the world is a holiday of freedom from Egypt associated with
Celebrated with flatbread.
celebrated with flatbread. So, you can go all sociological and anthropological about this and say that, well, Egypt was, the home of sourdough and leaving behind Egypt is leaving behind sourdough. But that's all very nice. But, I
Doesn't
can,
explain what's wrong with sourdough. We leave it behind Egypt by removing all the sphinxes from your house.
yeah, I could just say that we should no longer have, triangled shaped things because it reminds us of the pyramids, right? But it makes it more, it makes it better because it makes it more meaningful because the sourdough really was the memory of the disease that infected society, which you might say is the sort of hoarding mentality in the wake of famine, which might have been the very impetus for slavery in the first place, which is that the obsessive desire to hoard required slave labor to create these huge hoarding cities, right? And sourdough is just what you get when you have a society that's constantly keeping bread around and will never waste bread, even old bread. And suddenly you get the sourdough, fermented dough. Yeah.
So at this point, our session was about to wrap up. And like I said at the top of the episode, I was curious and a little nervous to see how Rabbi Foreman would respond to what I had to show him and what we would explore together. So before we turned off our mics, I checked in with him and he gave me his honest thoughts on what we had discussed so far.
Look, it's indisputable that Exodus 16 is connected to Exodus 12, right? So that I think is indisputable. I think it's also, I think the argument about going from bitter to sweet is persuasive. I think the the idea of sour having to do with hoarding, it's a really interesting theory, right? It's a it is a really interesting theory. Don't know if I would bet my house on it, but maybe you don't bet your house on theories. Exactly. You bet your house more on evidence than theories. A theory is just there to explain the evidence that you would bet your house on. So there is bet your house evidence. The other thing is, it's like I would also want to see what the larger meaning of the move from bitter to sweet is.
I really appreciated that reflection. One of the main goals with this season, in addition to all the good stuff about matzah and mun and bitter and sweet, is to share with you Rabbi Foreman's process. You clearly see how careful he is to tease everything apart and identify what's clear to him and what needs more work and why. It's really a testament to Michelle's keen eye that Rabbi Foreman was sold on the intertextual parallels by the end of our session. And I was super happy to hear that he felt we'd done some good work making sense of their meaning. But I have to tell you, I was really surprised when he said we needed to continue to explore the meaning of the movement from bitter to sweet. Hadn't we just done that? What more did he want? But that's the thing with Rabbi Foreman and his process. Many times, even when it seems like we've come to the end of the road, he's determined to keep pushing, to go even deeper. Our exploration of the movement from bitter to sweet in the Exodus story was no exception. You see, what we were noticing wasn't just a move from bitter to sweet. There were all of these in-between stages. After the sourdough, there were bitter herbs with neutral matzah together. Then, just neutral matzah. Then finally, sweet mun. That's what was nagging Rabbi Foreman. What was being added with these in-between stages? That's what he couldn't let go of. And I'm glad he didn't, because when we next met, what he had come up with to address that question really knocked my socks off. And I can't wait for you to hear it yourself in the next episode. We'll see you then. And hey, we'd love to listen to you for a change. Please leave us a voice note with your thoughts, your reactions, what you love about the show, even what you don't love about the show. There's a link in the show notes. It is really easy to use. I hope you'll try it out.